This is MacroVoices, the free weekly financial podcast targeting professional finance, high net worth individuals, family offices, and other sophisticated investors. MacroVoices is all about the brightest minds in the world of finance and macroeconomics telling it like it is, bullish or bearish, no holds barred. Now, here are your hosts, Eric Townsend and Patrick Ceresna.
MacroVoices episode 461 was pre-recorded earlier this month for release on Tuesday, December 31st, 2024. I'm Eric Townsend. This is the second of our two pre-recorded year-end special episodes. By listener request, we're giving you long-form, double-length interviews this holiday weekend. The topic is advanced nuclear energy technologies and how they'll fit into the formative nuclear renaissance.
And I'm Patrick Ceresna. Eric, what's on deck for our second year-end special episode?
My guest once again will be Copenhagen Atomics founder Thomas Jam Pedersen. This week's topic will be a deep dive on nuclear fuels and fuel cycles, including the economics of thorium rather than uranium-fired nuclear power. And I think you're really going to love this episode, as we'll be covering material that almost nobody else is talking about. In the interest of full disclosure, I want to again mention that I'm an angel investor in Copenhagen Atomics, the company founded by this week's guest.
Eric's long-form interview with Copenhagen Atomics founder Thomas Jam Pedersen is coming up next. Then Eric and I will be back for our post-game segment to discuss the investment opportunities in the sector.
And now, with this week's special guest, here's your host, Eric Townsend.
Joining me now is Copenhagen Atomics founder and CEO Thomas Jam Pedersen. We've prepared a slide deck to accompany today's interview. Registered users will find the download link in your Research Roundup email. If you don't have a Research Roundup email, it means you haven't yet registered at macrovoices.com. Just go to our homepage, macrovoices.com, click the red button above Thomas Jam's picture that says looking for the downloads. Alternatively, the YouTube version of this podcast will have the slide deck on the screen as we're speaking. You can find that on our MacroVoices YouTube channel. Thomas Jam, welcome back. I think our first interview last week was well received by the audience. I'm really excited to dive into this one. Let's go ahead and start right into the slide deck at page 3. Talking about thinking at scale. You know, something I've noticed is your presentations almost always start with the same slide I like to start with, which is the Our World in Data series that talks about global energy consumption by source and breaks down how much energy we're using on a global basis. It seems like you and I both like to think in terms of the big picture of how much energy the world needs, how much we need to supply, how we're going to do it. I've noticed that almost nobody else in the nuclear space thinks that way. Why do you think that is?
Yes, thanks, Eric, for having me back. Yes, you're correct that this slide is the one that got me started many, many years ago, because that was when I personally started to understand how the global energy system works. So I went back to that slide many, many times. This is 15 years ago now. And it gives you a good picture of how the whole world works, because the whole world is built on a fundament of energy. And therefore, by understanding, the history of how we got the energy as humans and how this is supposedly changing over the years, you can sort of make the strategy for, in my case, Copenhagen Atomics into the future, because from that strategy, we can kind of understand how the energy systems globally are going to change.
Thomas Jam, I couldn't agree more. And if there's one point that I think really summarizes what I want the audience to understand about this episode and the motivation for it, it's that we're thinking about what it would take to solve the energy problems for the whole planet, not how to sell the next nuclear reactor or how to start a company in the high-tech business, but how to take on this energy problem that so few people really have their heads around. So thinking about the scale of the whole problem is what gets us, I think, to a view that's very different from the mainstream, which is that you really have to be on a thorium rather than uranium-based nuclear energy strategy in order to solve the biggest problems that we face as a society. And I think the reason that very few people think that that's true is because they haven't really thought it through at scale. Moving on to page 4, I'm going to borrow one of Elon Musk's favorite quotes. He always likes to say that when people talk to him about Tesla, They always assumed the hard part was engineering and designing the electric cars at Tesla, but actually it was getting the manufacturing right that was the most important part and the hardest part for that company to take on. The analogy here is that when contemplating nuclear energy transition, most people, as we look at this nuclear renaissance and talk about Generation 4 nuclear technology, they're looking at the reactor designs. They're looking at, okay, how cool is the sodium fast reactor? Oh, wait a minute, look at these pebble bed high temperature reactors. That's really cool. I like the way the design works. If you really want to solve this problem, you've got to look at the fuel cycles and think not about the design of the car, but about the design of the network of gas stations that are going to supply those cars, because that's the much harder problem to solve. And once you understand that problem, you reach very, very different conclusions than you reach if you're just looking at the design of the reactors. So I say the fuel cycles and supply chain challenges are the most important part, and those are the things that very few people have gotten their heads around at scale. Folks, I know MacroVoices is not an engineering podcast, but a finance podcast. So I promise slide 5 is the only one where we're going to ask you at all to focus on nuclear physics. And it's going to be really quick, short, and to the point. All we need to do to make the rest of this make sense is to get this word isotopes into your vocabulary if it's not already there. So very briefly, atoms is what everybody thought was the smallest unit of matter until we realized there are actually particles inside those atoms. Those atoms come in different flavors called elements. Everybody knows this from high school chemistry. So you've got the number 1 on the periodic table is hydrogen, number 2 is helium, number 3 is lithium, and number 4 is beryllium, and so forth, all the way up to eventually number 92 is uranium, and number 94 is plutonium. It's not listed there, but it is, and so on and so forth. Well, those numbers are actually referring to the number of protons inside the nucleus of the atom. That's what you need to know in order to know which element a given atom is. What most people don't even think about, because it frankly doesn't matter to chemistry, but it matters very much to nuclear science, is the number of neutrons inside the nucleus of each atom. And it's the number of neutrons that determine which isotope it is, or probably a better way of saying that is the word isotope is defined simply as a word or a description for a specific type of element that has a certain number of neutrons in its nucleus. The example shown on the left side of the slide here is for hydrogen, the simplest atom because it only has 1 proton. The common isotope of hydrogen is the one that doesn't have any neutrons in the nucleus at all. That's shown on the left. We call it just regular old hydrogen, although technically it does have another name, which is protium. If you add a neutron to the mix, as we see in the middle of the picture there, that one's called deuterium, and that's just another isotope of hydrogen. If you add a second neutron, then it's called tritium, or hydrogen 3. So the number after the name of the element is the total number of nucleons, the total number of protons and neutrons together. So tritium is also known as hydrogen 3. Similarly, as you go further up the table of elements, you get lots and lots of protons and lots of neutrons, and that's where those big numbers come from. So something like uranium-235, well, you know it has only 92 protons because that's what makes it uranium. The rest of what makes up that 235 is all of the neutrons that are in the nucleus. So that's what's meant by the word isotope, and that's really all of the nuclear engineering or nuclear physics that we need to learn in order for this episode to make sense. Thomas Jam, let's dive into slide 6, and I want to get your help with this one. There are only 3 isotopes that are called fissile isotopes, meaning that they can sustain a nuclear chain reaction. The first one is uranium-235, and that's the only one that occurs in nature, but it only occurs in small quantities. Tell us a little bit more about uranium-235 and why it's so important.
Yes, you talked very briefly about isotopes before, and it's right. So we have all the things we burn, fossil fuels and all the other things. When we burn something, it's a chemical reaction, and that has to do with the electrons. But when we do nuclear reactions, it has to do with the core of the atom, and that's the protons and especially the neutrons. And we also call that burning when we burn atoms. And like you said, uranium-235 is the only one that we can find in nature that can do that, which can create a chain reaction. with a nuclear reaction instead of a chemical reaction. And we should also mention, I think we didn't do that last time, that when you make nuclear fission, you generate more than 1 million times the amount of energy per kilogram than you do when you burn things. If you burn fossil fuels or even explosives or whatever you can burn, usually nuclear reactions, there's 1 million times more energy per kilogram. So of course, it's a much more powerful type of energy. And that's also why it's used for atomic bombs. But anyways, the only isotope that could do that from nature is uranium-235, and it's very rare or very scarce. The good story is that there are two other isotopes, plutonium-239 and uranium-233, which humans can make inside nuclear reactors. And they have pros and cons, of course. And they work in a similar way as uranium-235, but of course the price is different and some of the waste is slightly different and so on.
So the thing that's frankly crazy to me is, despite this industry being 70 years old, we only use uranium-235 today, despite the fact that it's the rarest of these three isotopes that could be used as nuclear fuels. And we're basically using it up pointlessly when we could be making the other two isotopes. We make a little bit in a conventional nuclear reactor. A little bit of plutonium-239 gets made kind of almost as a side effect of the nuclear chain reaction. So plutonium-239 is the next fissile isotope. It's a man-made element. The only plutonium-239 that exists is that which human beings have produced by I love this word, transmutating. It sounds like it's directly out of Star Trek. You take the uranium-238, that's the 99.7% of natural uranium that is not fissile. It can't be used as fuel by itself. You run it through a nuclear reactor, you make it absorb some more neutrons, it turns into plutonium-239. That is fissile, and it can be used in order to run a nuclear reactor. Now, about 2 or 3% of the uranium-238 that goes into a nuclear reactor as fuel, and we discussed this last week, does get used, turned into plutonium and used as fuel. But all the way back in the 1940s, they figured out how to design nuclear reactors that would be much more efficient at converting more of that uranium-238 into fissile plutonium-239 so that we wouldn't have to use up all of the uranium-235, which is so scarce and which we only have a limited supply of. You'd think that if we figured out how to do that way back in the 1940s, and ironically, the very first nuclear reactor which demonstrated the generation of electricity was the experimental breeder reactor, one that was designed to do exactly this, to turn uranium-238 into plutonium-239 so that we could use the 99.7% of natural uranium that would otherwise go to waste. Yet, despite that it was demonstrated on December 20th of 1951 that was possible, we haven't been doing it that way. We've been doing it the much more wasteful way of just using uranium-235 almost exclusively. Now, there's a third fissile isotope, which frankly, I think Thomas Jam and I agree is the best of the bunch. It is the uranium-233, which is a different isotope of uranium. That one can only be made inside of a nuclear reactor, but it's not made from uranium. It's made from another heavy element called thorium-232. Thomas Jam, tell us a little bit more about why uranium-233 is so important, and why is it that if it is so important, we really don't use it and very few people even know about it?
Yeah, that's correct. It was discovered all the way back in 1942 that thorium can go through the cycle and generate uranium-233. It's the best fissile isotope. So we have these three fissile isotopes, but of those three, it's the best one in thermal spectrum. Thermal spectrum means slow neutrons, and that means that if you slow down the neutrons, then you get the best neutron economy with this last uranium-233. And that's really, really important because this means that now you can build what is called a breeder reactor in thermal spectrum. And that means you can build the reactor smaller. You need less amount of fuel to get the reactor started, and therefore it's more economic. Both you need less fuel to get it started, but also the thorium is much, much less expensive than uranium for various reasons. So if you build a breeder reactor in thermal spectrum, you can get the energy price really far down compared to any uranium-based reactor. And when I say uranium, I mean uranium-235. So that's why thorium is so important, because from physics and from simple math you can do on a napkin, you can show that it's sort of an order of magnitude better than any uranium reactor you could ever build. And that's, of course, why we should be looking at it. So there's been a lot of misunderstandings over the years, because for many, many decades, people didn't believe or didn't try to figure out if you could make a breeder reactor in thermal spectrum. The first guy to suggest that was Alvin Weinberg back in the 1950s and 60s. But back then they didn't have computer simulations. But he thought, this is probably going to work. And it was not until 2022 that we knew for sure in Copenhagen Atomics that it would be possible, because we had made simulation tools that could actually do the right simulation so we could figure it out. Before then, we also had to sort of rely on calculations that were not 100% correct. But that's why uranium-233 is super important. I want to make one more note that, of course, we can find uranium-235 in nature, and there's many countries who have that. So that's the easy place to start for all countries. Then there are some countries who have separated out plutonium-239. And the problem with plutonium is that it's also used for most nuclear bombs. So it has a lot of bad reputation. And then uranium-233, there's a little bit of a stockpile of that in the USA, and maybe a little bit of a stockpile in Russia. We don't really know about the Russian stockpile, but in the US, the crazy people in Oak Ridge are trying to downblend it. It's really, really valuable stuff, like way more valuable than diamonds. And then they're trying to destroy it. It's really a horror story, but that's because they don't really understand it. And I don't blame them too much, because most of the nuclear engineers that have been educated in the last 5 decades, they didn't really hear about thorium and uranium-235 during their education. It has been sort of suppressed. And I think it's because there were some people back in the 70s who tried to put some of this thorium and uranium-233 in regular light water reactors. And if you do that, it doesn't create any better fuel economy than good old uranium-235. So it actually doesn't work in the existing fleet of reactors we have around the world. You need a new type of reactor to make thorium and uranium-233 work in this way, where it's like order of magnitude better. But we will get to that in some of the next slides.
Now, uranium-233 does actually have some bad histories, a failure in its history that very few people understand, and it's very important to understand. That failure is that uranium-233 was considered by the Manhattan Project for building the bomb with. And what they concluded was that uranium-233, although, as Thomas Jam just said, is the best isotope for making nuclear energy with, it's the worst of these isotopes for trying to make a bomb with. And what they concluded is, although it might be technically possible to make a bomb from uranium-233, it would be so much more difficult that it really wasn't worth it. So they abandoned U-233 from the Manhattan Project for bomb making. Now, when you stop and think about it, that's not a bug. It's a huge feature. It means that if we were working with uranium-233 as the basis of our nuclear energy programs, well, you'd be working with an isotope which, although technically it might be possible to make a bomb from it, it's much more difficult to make a bomb from uranium-233 than it is from plutonium or uranium-235. That's a really good thing in terms of mitigating nuclear weapons risks. But I've actually heard nuclear engineers say, the uranium-233, no, they ruled that out on the Manhattan Project. It's no good. It's not worth using. Well, it's no good for making bombs. That doesn't mean it's no good for making nuclear energy. Let's move on to page 7. Thomas Jam, explain where we said, you get this stuff out of a nuclear reactor. Talk in a little more detail about how that happens. What do you do with thorium in order to turn it into uranium-233? Page 7.
This page 7 explains how you convert thorium inside a nuclear reactor to this uranium-233 fuel. And it basically happens if you have slow neutrons, so neutrons that have been slowed down with something called a moderator. A moderator can either be water or beryllium or graphite or some material that is great at slowing down neutrons. So if you have a slow neutron, natural thorium-232 can capture that neutron, and then it automatically converts into thorium-233, and then that also decays. So there's a radioactive decay from thorium-233 to protactinium-233. Protactinium-233 is also an element that doesn't exist in nature, but you can create that in a nuclear reactor. And then that protactinium-233 then takes an average of 30 days as half-life. So after 30 days, it will convert into uranium-233. And this is then the brilliant fuel or the great fuel for nuclear reactors. So it's sort of automatically created inside the stomach or of the nuclear reactor, but it's not a quick process because it has this half-life of 30 days. So it takes some time to be generated, and then slowly you generate more and more fuel. And the picture we have here in slide 7 is called a fuel cycle when it's converted from thorium to uranium. And like I said before, this is the most efficient fuel cycle in thermal spectrum. And why thermal spectrum is important is that you need less fuel per gigawatt of energy you create to get that whole reactor started. So the upfront cost of buying the fuel is less per kilowatt hour or megawatt hour of energy you generate. So that's why it's important.
And, of course, there is no enrichment required on thorium in order to produce the uranium-233. So all of the conversion and enrichment bottlenecks, for those of you who heard my interview with Justin Hune back on December 5th, we talked about what Justin and I think is going to be a coming bottleneck in the global uranium market when there's not enough conversion and enrichment facilities. Well, thorium doesn't need any of those enrichment facilities, and that is a major differentiator by itself. Let's do what we promised at the beginning of this podcast now and think about the really big picture, moving on to page 8. This pie chart shows all of the nuclear fuel that is available to supply humanity for the rest of forever, because we're moving from the age of oil into the age of nuclear. I think the age of nuclear is going to power humanity almost indefinitely. But look at what we're doing. Now, if you're viewing this on a mobile device, you might not even see that there's actually 3 colored slices to this pie chart. The green one in the top, which is 24.82%, that's uranium-238, the common form of uranium, which is most natural uranium mined out of the ground. The 75% of nuclear fuels that are available to humanity are thorium. That's the amber-colored gigantic wedge. There's an itsy-bitsy, you can barely see it, dark blue wedge, which is fissile uranium-235. That's 0.18%. Less than 0.2% of all of the nuclear fuel available to the world is uranium-235. And that's the only kind that actually gets used in conventional light water nuclear reactors. What goes into those reactors is not just U-235. U-235 is only 5% of it. The other 95 is we take a whole bunch of that green fuel in the 24.82% and we waste it. All we do is we make it get radioactive and we don't burn more than about 2 or 3% of it as fuel, because those reactors are not designed to make good use of these fertile nuclear fuels, which are U-238 and thorium-232. Thomas Jam has probably a much better graphic taste than I do. He's got essentially the same idea on page 9 that I just was my slide on page 8. Thomas Jam's graphics are much more aesthetically pleasing on page 9. So why don't I let you talk through this, Thomas Jam? What's going on page 9 with 5% of global energy comes from that tiny sliver? Why are we not using the rest of the natural uranium or any of the thorium, which is where most of the nuclear fuel is that's available to humanity?
So that, like I said, that there has been a few attempts in the past, history all the way back from 50s and 60s and 70s, to try to use thorium in sort of the traditional solid fuel reactors. And it doesn't work. I mean, it does work. You do produce energy, but it's not economically favorable over using good old enriched uranium. And that's why we've stuck with those solid fuel reactors, and that's why we're using uranium. And like you said, in most of those reactors we use around the world, we need to enrich the uranium-235 before the reactor can even start on that. So that's enrichment is a very expensive process. But there are some reactors that They have, for example, in Canada and India that are called heavy water reactors. There's also some more countries that have them, where you don't need to enrich the uranium, but then you need heavy water. And the heavy water used to be super expensive back in the day, and therefore they were not super economic against the light water reactors or the reactors where you have enriched uranium. So that's why those two types of solid fuel reactors work. But in order to make thorium work, you need what is called a molten salt reactor, a liquid fueled reactor, which is something very different from the solid fuel reactors that most countries and most companies are talking about. And that's really why we made this podcast today, because we want to explain the difference between solid fuel reactors or classical nuclear reactors and these new liquid fuel reactors or molten salt reactors. They have different names, but it's a shame that we don't even talk about how we could use the thorium, because there is, like you said before, there's almost 1,000 times more thorium on this planet than there is uranium-235. And if you look at when we will run out of thorium, if we wanted to make the same amount of energy from wind and solar, we would run out of steel and all the other materials we need for wind and solar way before we would run out of thorium. So that means that thorium is actually also a renewable energy source. It's way more renewable than wind and solar, but we don't really talk about it like that.
Well, and I think it's really astonishing that even within the nuclear industry, some of the best experts are not aware of a lot of this. There was a Senate hearing where they pulled in this guy who was supposed to be the super nuclear expert witness guy, who came in before a congressional hearing. And they asked him about thorium, and he kind of scratched his head and he says, well, you can make a nuclear reactor work with thorium instead of uranium. And he just said, I just can't figure out why anybody would want to. Well, let me answer his rhetorical question on page 10. This is my slide that I use when talking about Copenhagen Atomics reactor. This one is not from Thomas Jam. And what it shows is Thomas Jam's reactor design, which is a 100 megawatt thermal energy nuclear reactor that comes in the form factor of a standard 40-foot shipping container. Now, if you wanted to produce that same 100 megawatts of thermal energy in a coal-fired power plant, it would take 131,000 metric tons of coal per year. That's about $20 million worth of coal, or a railway train 20 kilometers long. That's how much coal it takes to make 100 megawatts thermal 24/7 for a year. Thomas Jam's reactor produces the same amount of energy from 36 kilograms of thorium. Now, I'll say that again. It's not 36,000 metric tons. It's not 36 metric tons. It's 36 kilos of thorium, the amount of thorium that a strong man my size could physically pick up and carry across the room. The cost of that full year's supply of thorium is not $20 million worth of coal. It's $1,800. It would take about 34 of Thomas Jam's reactors in order to match the power of an AP1000 reactor from Westinghouse. But Thomas Jam's reactors can do that on $61,000 worth of fuel, as opposed to $194 million worth of enriched uranium fuel that it takes to run that Westinghouse AP1000. Now, the Copenhagen Atomics reactor runs on thorium as its primary fuel source. That's obviously where the big economic advantage comes from. But there is a catch, and that catch is, the way I like to think of it is like kindling in a fireplace. You can't just start the fire by holding a match up to a giant oak log. You've got to have some kindling in order to get the fire started before those big logs are going to catch fire. The same thing is true of these thorium-fueled reactors. They have to have something called Kickstarter fuel, which I think of as the kindling in a fireplace. You can use the same low-enriched uranium fuel that goes into a conventional nuclear reactor as that kindling in order to get Thomas Jam's reactor started. But the advantage of the Copenhagen Atomics design is you also have the option of using recycled spent nuclear fuel waste. So you can use the waste that's left over from the old nuclear reactors of yesteryear and essentially recycle that waste, turn it into kindling in order to start up these Copenhagen Atomics reactors. Now, for the moment, that's easier said than done because there's a lot of regulatory hurdles. We'll come to those in just a minute. But this is the reason. This slide really says it to me. You take what takes $20 million worth of coal and you do it for a fuel cost of $1,800. That is the reason, Mr. Whoever your name is, the guy that was testifying as the expert witness and has far more credentials than I do, that it makes sense and why you would want to do this with thorium rather than uranium. It is shocking to me how few people understand this. Thomas Jam, this is not new, and it's not you guys that figured it out. Everything I'm talking about in this slide was figured out in the 1960s. And you would think any degreed nuclear engineer who studied history of the industry would know everything I just said. In your estimation, Thomas Jam, what percentage of degreed nuclear engineers already know about all this?
It started back sort of around 2010 that the engineering schools around the globe started to see a lot of young people applying for nuclear engineering. And a lot of the old guys, they couldn't understand why suddenly young people applied for nuclear engineering. But it was because there was a number of videos on YouTube about thorium, and they got really excited that this was a huge opportunity in the future. And so they wanted to study nuclear engineering. And you're absolutely right that most of those old people who taught nuclear engineering, they didn't talk about thorium at all. But these young people now demanded to learn something about it. And, of course, the old timers, they could look it up and start explaining it because they understood the sort of the nuclear physics behind it and the math and everything, but it was just not commonplace. It was not something that was talked about. So I think everybody who got a nuclear engineering degree between, 1980 and 2000 and whatever, 10, they probably didn't hear about thorium at all during their whole nuclear engineering education. And if they heard about it, it was sort of put down and said, we're not using it. And it was not explained why we were not using it. But like I said before, you can do the calculation on a napkin to show that it doesn't make any sense in a solid fuel reactors. And all the reactors we have in the world today are solid fuel reactors. So that's why they didn't bother to teach people about it. But then these young people came in after 2010, and they basically demanded to hear about it. And they quickly, they also came to the realization that you need a liquid fuel reactor, a molten reactor. So they also wanted to learn about those. And so I'm actually one of those, but I got my engineering degree way before that. So I had to study the whole thing about molten reactors on my own. But yeah, that was also quite an eye-opener for me.
Well, I've been really surprised myself. As you know, I have a niece who's studying nuclear engineering. She went to the molten salt reactor workshop in Knoxville, Tennessee recently, as did your CTO who spoke there. And she showed up in a thorium T-shirt on my suggestion. I figured it would be a good conversation starter since she's looking for a job when she graduates from school in June. And she took a fair amount of ribbing from people even at the molten salt reactor workshop saying, "Oh, you're one of those thorium true believers, huh?" Well, look, if you're not a thorium true believer yet, let's move on to page 11 and talk about what it costs to run this planet in terms of fuel cost. The answer on fossil fuels is $6.25 trillion per year. That's the size of the global fossil fuel markets, coal, oil, and natural gas aggregated. $6.25 trillion is the annual size of that market. If you wanted to run the entire global economy on nuclear using solid fuel nuclear, uranium-fired nuclear, you could get that fuel cost down to about $2.3 trillion or almost a 63% savings. If you ran it on thorium, you could run the entire global economy for $312 million a year worth of thorium. Now, that's not counting the Kickstarter fuel. It's not counting the kindling to start the fire in the fireplace. And ironically, it ends up that the kindling costs way more than the actual cordwood in the fireplace costs. So if you have to pay for low-enriched uranium to use as your Kickstarter fuel, well, then it's $144 billion instead of $312 million. But once we get enough of these thorium reactors running that we don't need any more kindling to start the fires, you can run the entire global economy on $312 million a year. That's the cost of a sports team, as opposed to $6.25 trillion a year. So yes, I'm a thorium true believer. That's why. And I don't think hardly anybody understands these numbers. Thomas Jam, you've got your own slides that tell this same message. Why don't you take the stage with 12 and 13 in the deck? Talk about your arguments for the economics of thorium energy.
Yes, so slide 12 is basically to give people this perspective of what is the difference between a thorium breeder reactor cycle and all the regular solid fuel reactors. And you see that there's these two dots. There's the thorium dot up in the upper left-hand corner, and then there's the big uranium dot down in the lower right-hand corner. And the size of those dots give you some idea of how long it usually takes to build those type of reactors. So not only is thorium a lot cheaper, it's also a lot faster to build thorium reactors, at least the ones that Copenhagen Atomics are proposing to build. So that's why the economics of getting all energy in the whole world from thorium would be, orders of magnitude better. But of course, I should say that here we only look at the fuel cost. This slide doesn't talk about the cost of the reactor that you need, or it doesn't talk about the Kickstarter fuel. It only talks about the fuel cost. And there's a number of different solid fuel reactors. We have to admit that. And here we just take sort of the average. You can see in the lower left-hand corner, it says 60 gigawatt day per ton of uranium. And that's some of the most average reactors. They can generate 60 gigawatt days of energy per ton of uranium. And if you want to calculate that into gigawatt hours of energy per kilogram, that's what is on the y-axis. So that's the 1.44 gigawatt hour of energy per kilogram that you can get out of solid fuel reactors using uranium. And of course, there are different reactor designs, and we talked last time about advanced reactor designs. Actually, even though they are called advanced reactor designs, some of them have a worse fuel economy, and some have a slightly better fuel economy. But if you look at that big green uranium dot, it would move a little bit to the right or a little bit to the left. It wouldn't move very far up and down, maybe a little bit up and down, but not very far. So depending on all the other solid fuel reactor designs in the whole world, you can move that uranium dot sort of a little bit around, but not very much. But there's no way in hell or anything anywhere else that you can get the green dot for solid fuel reactors to move anywhere near the thorium dot up there in the right-hand corner. And that's simply because thorium is very plentiful, and we already mine for other materials where we get lots of thorium out of the ground. So the cost of thorium will never become very high. And right now, Copenhagen Atomics is the biggest customer in the world for thorium, and we've already bought thorium for several different sources. And the current price is right around $50 per kilogram. So we expect that price actually over the years to come down once that market for thorium becomes bigger and there are more suppliers and more customers. I expect that price to come down, but maybe not down to half, but $40 or $30 per kilogram. And as I show there, each kilogram of thorium in a thorium breeder reactor can generate 22.5 gigawatt hours of energy, which is a whole lot more than 10 times more than solid fuel uranium reactors. So that's why it's just, if you make the simple calculation, it's 1,407 times more efficient to use thorium fuel cycle than to use the solid fuel uranium fuel cycle. And that's really mind-blowing. I mean, we've never seen anything like this in the industrial history of the man. I mean, even transistors, when we invented transistors instead of radio tubes, they were slightly more efficient, and you could see sort of maybe 10 years down the road, they could be a little bit better. But of course, the transistor have this Gordon Moore rule where it doubles every 18 months, which is great. And that's why we've gotten to having mobile phones in our pockets with billions of transistors. But still, it was a slow growth. But with nuclear energy and thorium, we can get this 1,400 times better fuel economy right away, as soon as we change those new reactors.
Thomas Jam, that's covering, as you said, just the fuel cost. But what about the CapEx? Let's move on to page 13.
Yes, correct. So we compare the most common baseload types of nuclear plants. So, of course, we started with coal, which is the most common electricity generation baseload plants are coal plants. And you can see sort of both the CapEx and the OPEX, and you can also see the electricity cost that comes out of those. And of course, depending a little bit on the generation and where in the world you built them, coal-fired power plants usually have an electricity price between $30 and $60 per megawatt hour. You can see that they have sort of the fuel cost, the raw fuel cost when you buy the coal and it arrives on train carts. It costs roughly $400 million per year to power a 1 gigawatt coal-fired power plant. And I say up there in the subtitle that it's a 1 gigawatt electrical power plant in Europe or USA, because actually in places like India, you can even get it even cheaper, also in China. So to operate one of those plants, the operational cost, the maintenance, and the people who run it, it's like roughly $50 million per year. Of course, that also depends on what country and how old the plant is. And then you see down there in the orange colors down at the bottom, you can sort of see a depiction of how long it takes to build one of these plants. And that's, it also depends, but on average, it's 2 years to build a plant like that, to get it approved and build it and everything until it's up and running. And it costs roughly $2 billion in the Western world to build a coal-fired power plant. But of course, in the Western world, we don't want to build any more of those, even though they're actually still very economic. And we also saw that even though Germany tried to get rid of fossil fuels, now they get most of the energy from coal. So they had to go back to using coal again because they couldn't get the gas from Russia. Anyway, so the next one is the gas-fired power plants. Gas is slightly more expensive on average. It's like between $60 to $100 per megawatt hour. Of course, that also depends on where you're located and if you can get gas from Russia, or if you are in Texas, also the gas price is not that high. But it depends a lot on your location and around the world. But sort of on average, we put here that it costs $600 million to buy the gas. And then the operational cost of those type of reactors are similar to coal-fired power plant. But gas-fired power plants normally doesn't last for 50 years like a coal-fired power plant or a nuclear power plant. So in these 50 million of operational costs, it's also the restoration or refurbishing of the plant, a gas-fired power plant, to make it last for many years so that it's comparable. And finally, you can see down at the bottom that you can build gas-fired power plant really quickly in less than a year, and they're not very expensive upfront capex cost, only $1 billion or maybe even less. And then we come to the classical nuclear reactors, and they are crazy expensive if you look at the orange, and they take many years to build. So, of course, we've had the different examples. So down in Abu Dhabi, they were able to build these light water reactors in only 4 years. But for example, in Europe, we've built the Olkiluoto 3 plant in Finland that took 18 years. There's the Hinkley Point C that are currently being built. I think now the best estimate is 15 years. We also saw the Vogtle plants in Georgia and the US also took something like 15 years. I actually don't know exactly how long they took, but it was more than 10 years. So you can see that in the Western world, it usually takes more than 10 years to build nuclear power plants of the classical type, and they cost a lot of money. I just put 10 billion here, but some of them actually cost more than that per gigawatt. So they are crazy expensive compared to coal and gas. And then we've depicted with these orange colors that there are some people, especially the type of people who talk about small modular reactors, they believe that they can get the cost down and also the time it takes to build these type of reactors. That's basically the small modular reactors, like we said last time, it's a small misunderstood reactors because it's basically just a classical reactor, but then they try to make it smaller and make it faster. But they haven't really shown yet that they can make it faster or cheaper. So this orange part down there is still uncertain what it's going to cost and what it's going to take. But if we look at the fuel cost and the operational cost, the fuel cost is, of course, much lower than for coal and gas because nuclear fuel is cheaper than coal and gas. But then the operational cost is more expensive. But all in all, if you run a nuclear power plant for 60 years or more, then you can get the electricity price down to the roughly the same level as gas-fired power plants. And of course, nuclear energy, it doesn't release very much CO2. So compared to gas, it's more a clean energy source. And then in the fourth column, we compare to thorium breeder reactors from Copenhagen Atomics. And it has all the things you want. It has a quick deployment time down in the orange. It's cheap to build. It's fast to deploy. and then the operational cost is roughly the same as for gas and coal. But then the fuel cost, like we talked about in the previous slide, is almost nothing. And the reason why we put here a range between $50,000 to $300,000 is because some of the very first reactors is not going to be as great at breeding new fuel as they will eventually be. So in the very beginning, the first 5 or 7 years or something, it will be slightly more expensive in fuel cost. And then we will get down below the $50,000 per year. So it's only in the beginning that they're slightly more expensive, but it doesn't really matter in the bigger picture. It's a much better solution for rolling out large amount of clean energy for the whole world. And of course, Copenhagen Atomics has invented and patented a special reactor core called the onion core. We will get back to that later. And that's part of the reason why we can do this. But of course, other companies could also make thorium breeder reactors with a different type of reactor, or even buy a license to the patent we have. So it's not that just one company could do this. There's, of course, lots of companies who is eventually going to do thorium breeder reactors.
Thomas Jam, excellent job describing page 13. I'm going to play devil's advocate and say if there was somebody here from Oklo or from one of the other companies that's working on advanced nuclear, they might say, wait a minute, you're talking your own book because you're comparing coal gas classic nuclear and to your thorium breeder reactor. But what about the other advanced nuclear technologies that we talked about last week, like fast sodium reactors? Those are also a lot more efficient than classic nuclear. What I'm going to say in reaction to that is you've got to go back to where we started this podcast, which is thinking about the big picture in the fuel cycle, moving on to page 14. Those fast sodium reactors are really cool. They run on HALEU fuel instead of the regular 5% low-enriched uranium. Well, guess what? HALEU fuel costs upwards of $25,000 per kilo. The advantage of something like a sodium fast reactor is it's going to use more of the U-238. So it's, first of all, it's got more of the blue U-235 to burn. It's going to take the U-238, which is the fertile material that's not fissile when it starts. It's going to breed it into plutonium, and it's going to make much better use of it. So these other advanced reactors do some really cool things too. But when you stop and think about, well, wait a minute, what if you were to not just build a few of those Oklo reactors? What if you were going to build enough of them to replace all the energy we get from fossil fuels? How much HALEU, that's the very high assay, low enriched uranium, almost 20% enriched, would it take to fuel all those reactors? And what would it take in terms of enrichment facilities that we don't have today in order to make all of that HALEU fuel? When you start to do that kind of analysis, you realize that the HALEU-fueled fast spectrum advanced reactor technologies, they're really impressive when you look at the sports car, the design of the reactor. When you look at the design of the network of gas stations we would need to fuel those reactors with, it's a very different conclusion. And that's the point that I'm trying to make on page 14 there. The other thing that I think is really important, moving on to page 15, is the public is sick of nuclear meltdowns, fuel rod meltdowns. We've got to have reactor designs which are completely impervious to fuel rod meltdowns. Now, a lot of nuclear experts would say, well, wait a minute, with Generation 3 plus advanced nuclear reactors like the Westinghouse AP1000, those fuel rod meltdowns are not nearly as big of a risk as they were 30 or 40 years ago. Yeah, well, guess what? They're still possible, and the public is emotional, and they're freaked out about it. We need meltdown-proof nuclear fuels that can't possibly melt down. The two big contenders are TRISO fuels. Those are the ones used in the pebble bed reactors we talked about last week in the first episode of this podcast. And the other one is the fluoride and chloride fuels that are used in molten salt reactors. Thomas Jam, tell us about both of those in terms of how they work and what they do in order to prevent nuclear meltdowns.
So it's correct that you say that the public is afraid of nuclear meltdowns, but that's sort of a little bit odd because nobody has ever died from that. There's a guy called Brett Kugelmass who says, he even put out a bet, and I think it was like $10,000 or something like that, is if anybody could show him how anybody could ever die from a meltdown. And it's true that meltdown is not dangerous. It's very expensive to clean up afterwards for the company where it happens. but it's likely not going to kill anyone. But it's true that the general public and sort of the fear mongering has been put around meltdown. And for that reason, there's some companies who said, okay, let's try to solve that problem, which is not really a problem, but let's try to solve it anyways. And then they came up with a different type of fuel called triso fuel or pebble beds. It is true that they're less likely to melt down, and maybe there's a smaller risk of proliferation, so it can also be used at military bases in the middle of a war zone. Maybe it's better for that than solid fuel reactors. So I also say that you probably wouldn't use molten salt reactors in the middle of a war zone. But apart from that, I don't see the big benefit of triso fuel. I know some people try to give it a big deal, but I think when you compare that to molten salt reactors or liquid fuels, which is listed at the bottom, you get a lot of benefits. And the triso fuel is super expensive. Both the enrichment is, of course, expensive, but also production of those pebbles are expensive. Of course, if we make like a gazillion of those or a billion of those pebbles, maybe we can get the price down of the pebble production, but the enrichment is still going to be very expensive. So that's why I think liquid fuels are still much better. And I list some of the reasons down there because you can remove fission products. That's super important because that gives you superior fuel economy. And then also that you can refuel the reactor online. You don't have to stop the reactor. That's also very important. Of course, some of the people who make pebble beds, they will also say you can refuel online, but it's a different type of refueling. You cannot change the fuel composition really in the same way you can with liquid fuel reactors or molten salt reactors. And certainly you cannot make a breeder reactor, neither in fast spectrum or thermal spectrum with these pebbles, but you can do that with a molten salt reactor. You can actually even do that with a fast chloride fueled molten salt reactor. You can also make breeder reactors, but I would contest that the fuel economy or the price of the energy would not be able to compete with the fluoride thermal breeder reactors. And then it's much easier to reuse your materials like lithium-7 or beryllium if you have a liquid fuel reactor. So those were some of the benefits, but I think we need to move on to the next slide.
Thomas Jem, you're exactly right. So let's move on to page 16, where we get into spent nuclear fuel waste reprocessing. This slide came from last week's podcast. I'm going to skip most of the details and focus on the yellow highlights at that spent nuclear fuel waste. And again, it's not green slime. It's not purple slime with big bubbles coming out of it. It's these big metal fuel assemblies that look like the picture on the right side of the slide there. They're radioactive. They get stored in dry casks, which are big vertical cylindrical tubes. We'll show you a picture of those in just a minute. What's inside of them is some uranium that never got used, perfectly good uranium that never got used, some fission byproducts. I'll explain in just a second what that means. And then just 1% of it is the nasty stuff, the plutonium that causes all of the weapons proliferation risks and which also makes it you stay radioactive for as much as 100,000 years and causes all of the headaches associated with storage. Wouldn't it be great if we could figure out a way to recycle that spent nuclear fuel waste and get that 1% of nasty stuff separated from the 99% of good stuff that could probably be reused in order to make fuel for other nuclear reactors? That was all figured out in the 1940s, but it's almost illegal today, and it's the U.S. government that's behind it. So let's go into the next slide and explain, first of all, what are these fission byproducts that we talk about? Well, nuclear fission is the process that makes nuclear energy possible, of splitting heavy atoms like uranium-235 or uranium-233 in half. Well, when you split a big atom in half, you get two small atoms. Those two small atoms are called the fission byproducts. And there's a certain amount of randomness as to exactly what elements you're going to get. Well, you're basically taking a great big atom and you're shooting a bullet at it, a neutron more accurately, that kind of cuts it in half. Well, exactly how big is each half? Well, that's going to determine which atoms you get or which elements you get. There could be quite a few different possibilities, and some of them will have a really detrimental effect because they absorb the neutrons that you need in order to keep that chain reaction going. So you want to be able to get rid of those fission byproducts if you can. Moving on to page 18, let's talk about how recycling of used nuclear fuel ought to work. Then after we've covered how it should work, I'll explain why the U.S. government doesn't allow that to happen. Thomas Jam, this is one of your slides. Why don't you talk through of the spent fuel waste? 95% of it is perfectly good natural uranium that could and should be recycled. What's the other 5%?
Yeah, the 5% that is green on this circle in the middle is all the radioactive parts. It's the fission products and it's the transuranics, and we have a scale-up version on the upper right-hand corner. And most of it is fission products. And potentially in the future, we could mine those fission products. But right now, it's most sensible to just store them for 300 years. And most of those, like you said, they already been stored for the first 50 years. And in those 50 years, they lost most of the radioactivity. So they're already not that radioactive. But we should separate those out and store them for the remaining 250 years or up to 300 years. And after that, there's so little radioactivity left that you can put them back into nature or recycle them and use them in industries. Then the orange part is the 1%. That's transuranics. And transuranics means all the isotopes that are higher numbers than uranium. In the periodic table, uranium is the element in nature with the highest number. We humans can make other elements with even higher numbers, but they are not found in nature, any of them. And they are called transuranics. And most of that 1% is actually plutonium. So, like 90% of that 1% or 9 out of 10 atoms is plutonium. And we can use that as the Kickstarter fuel in our reactors. And by using it as Kickstarter fuel, we convert that transuranics, all of those transuranics, into fission products, which only needs to be stored for 300 years. So it's a way to get rid of that long-lived nuclear waste. It's not really waste, but the 1% is what's causing us to have to store traditional nuclear spent fuel in deep geological storage. But we don't need that if we burn that away as Kickstarter fuel in one of the Thorium reactors.
So I just want to reiterate for our listeners, everything you see on this slide here is not some brand new 2020s technology. This was all figured out 50 years ago. We're not allowed to do most of this today because of policy, and I'll explain that in just a minute. But recycling or reprocessing spent nuclear fuel waste is something France has been doing for decades with great success. You end up with 4% of that spent nuclear fuel waste is fission byproducts that only have to be stored for a few hundred years. It's not that big of a deal. Some of those fission byproducts are actually valuable medical isotopes that once we figure out how to separate them out, you could sell them and make a profit at them. It's only that 1% that's the so-called bad stuff. But is it really bad stuff? There are some good purposes that it could be put to, and I'll say a good purpose and a really good purpose. Moving on to page 19, what it's used for today when they recycle it in France is to make something called MOX fuel or mixed oxide fuel. That's where they blend the plutonium that comes out of the reprocessing process with uranium in order to create essentially a high-test kind of reactor fuel that contains both uranium and reprocessed plutonium that can be burned in a nuclear reactor in order to make more energy. Not a bad idea, but it's not really an extraordinarily amazing idea either. The idea that I think is absolutely fantastic is what if you took the plutonium that comes out of the reprocessing of spent nuclear fuel waste and used it as the kindling to start a whole bunch of those thorium reactors so that we could build enough thorium reactors to replace every bit of the energy that we get from fossil fuels today. Well, that is not allowed under current rules and is not likely to be allowed anytime soon. Why not? Let's go through the history of this on page 20. It all started in 1946 with something called the Acheson-Lilienthal Report. That was actually some very good writing. What they said back in 1946 is, look, reprocessing of spent nuclear fuel waste is obviously a really good idea. It's something that we should do. But if you think about where the risks are, if rogue countries were trying to secretly start nuclear weapons programs, it would be in the enrichment of uranium in order to make reactor fuel, that they could secretly keep on enriching it and get it all the way up to weapons grade. And it would also be potentially in the reprocessing of spent nuclear fuel waste, where you have access to plutonium coming out of reactors. Maybe somebody would figure out a way to put that to use to make a bomb, and we don't want to see that happen. Now, it turns out they weren't really understanding that problem as well as they thought they did. I'll come back to that in just a minute. But for very good reasons, they said, look, maybe it would be better if nuclear weapons states like the United States and the UK did the reprocessing and made those services available to other smaller countries. Therefore, you could say, let's not allow those smaller countries to do their own enrichment or their own reprocessing. Big countries like the US and the UK ought to offer those reprocessing services to the rest of the world, and that would allow us to control things, just to prevent smaller countries from maybe secretly developing a weapons program under everybody's noses without them noticing it. This was back in 1946 when very little was known about this. That report was where this idea of putting restrictions on reprocessing and enrichment first came from. It then morphed through several other reports, eventually found its way into the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Now, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, among other things, says that non-weapons states can't do any enrichment or reprocessing of their spent nuclear fuel waste. The only reason that France is the one country that's been incredibly successful with reprocessing its spent nuclear fuel waste is that Charles de Gaulle famously refused to sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty back in 1968 when it was first proposed. Now, France eventually signed the NPT, but not until 1992, after France had established itself as a nuclear weapons state, thus exempting itself from those reprocessing restrictions. Today, the U.S. government uses something called Section 123 of the Atomic Energy Act of 1954. Now, back in 1954, when Section 123 was first enacted, it made sense. The U.S. government was really the only one on Earth that had figured out all this nuclear stuff. They wanted to share it responsibly with the rest of the world for the sake of civilian nuclear energy, but they didn't want anybody to be getting their hands on nuclear bombs. So they said, look, we're going to make a deal with other countries. If you want any cooperation at all from the United States on nuclear anything, you have to sign a treaty called a Section 123 agreement or a 123 agreement that says you promise not to do any enrichment or reprocessing of spent nuclear fuel waste unless the United States gives you permission to do so. Now, all of these rules actually made sense when they were adopted because the idea was that the United States would do reprocessing and would make those services available to anyone who needed it. So the 1940s and 1950s nuclear scientists and engineers didn't screw anything up. It took 1970s American politicians to really F things up, and boy, did they ever. What we've gotten to is a situation now where reprocessing is completely disallowed by the United States government, both inside the United States and outside. They say, we're not going to do any reprocessing of spent fuel waste, even though France has been doing it successfully for decades. We're not going to do it in the good old US of A, and we're going to use the leverage we have from all these Section 123 agreements to forbid any other country from reprocessing their spent nuclear fuel waste. So we're not doing any of this reprocessing, and we're not getting that plutonium that could be serving as the kindling for Thomas Jam's reactors and for any other company's molten salt thorium reactors that we desperately need in order to solve energy transition. Meanwhile, it's not 1954 anymore. It's not like the United States is the only country that understands nuclear engineering. So these rules don't make any sense. And I'm going to say my strongest ask of our audience for this whole podcast is if anyone listening has the the ear of Vivek Ramaswamy or Elon Musk, please ask them to put Section 123 at the very top of their hit list for the new Doge department to get rid of a regulation that just doesn't make sense anymore. This is the reason that we don't have reprocessing of spent nuclear fuel waste. So we have to ask the question, moving on to the right column of page 20, why is it that they're so worried about this? Well, what they're afraid of is bad guys, terrorists, or rogue nations getting their hands on the plutonium that's coming out of that waste and making a bomb from it. What they don't understand is that that argument just doesn't make sense. The next couple of pages are going to explain why. I like to use this analogy on page 21. I call it the elevator risk analogy. Suppose, and I'm recording this podcast from my home office on a high floor of a high-rise residential building. Now, if somebody wanted to kill me, it is possible that they could hijack one of Elon's rocket ships, and then a bunch of commandos could parajump from space using GPS navigation and wingsuits, breaking Felix Baumgartner's parachute altitude jumping record of jumping from space. They could somehow re-enter the atmosphere at supersonic speed, navigate to my building using GPS, land on the roof, rappel down the sides of the building, break through the windows, and shoot me with assault weapons. But you know what? Considering that there's no security in this building, it's a whole lot more likely that they would just walk through the lobby and take the elevator up to my floor. And if I wanted to think seriously about protecting myself against some kind of assassination risk, I'd start by securing the elevator before I worried too much about anybody trying to hijack one of Elon's rocket ships. What's happened is anti-nuclear activists latch on to these theoretically possible but completely implausible risks. And an example of that is the supposed risk of someone taking plutonium out of spent nuclear fuel waste and making a bomb from it. Why is that an unrealistic risk? Moving on to page 22. The reason is because what's in spent nuclear fuel waste is something called reactor-grade plutonium, not weapons-grade plutonium. Weapons-grade plutonium has less than 7% plutonium-240 and at least 93% plutonium-239, which is the good stuff, the stuff that you could make a bomb from. Thomas Jam, please explain what this story is here on reactor-grade plutonium and why that 37% of plutonium-240 that's in the spent nuclear fuel waste that comes out of nuclear reactors pretty much eliminates any possibility of anyone easily being able to make a bomb from it.
When you make a bomb, you first of all, you want the material you're using for making the bomb, you want it to be as least radioactive as possible. And then you don't want it to spontaneously start fissioning while you're assembling the bomb, or even while it's sitting there in your storage, because you want to make sure that it only fissions once you start the fission reaction and you have already dropped the bomb over your target. And that the plutonium-240 has sort of it makes the risk of fission and also the radiation much higher during production, and that's why you don't want to make bombs out of that. So you want to separate the plutonium-239 and the plutonium-240, and it's not entirely impossible to do that from physics, but it's super expensive. So nobody does that. I mean, not even in labs. The way they make plutonium-239 is that it's a process called roasting. So they roast depleted uranium into plutonium-239, and then they take it out and do chemical separation before any large amount of plutonium-240 and 241 has been created in the fuel. And all the countries who have made nuclear weapons so far, they have made special military reactors for this roasting process. And it's true that it could potentially be done in commercial light water reactors, even the types we have today. And then if you did it there, you would have to do this chemical process of separation in order to get your bomb fuel. But when we run civil nuclear reactors, we run them for a long time, maybe 2 or 3 years. The fuel is inside the reactor. The solid fuel rods are inside the reactor for 2 or 3 years. And this means that a lot of plutonium-240 and 241 has been created in the fuel. And that means that you would never try to use that for nuclear bombs because it's way too expensive to use that. You would use another reactor. But it's true that it's not, you cannot say that it's entirely impossible.
Well, it's exactly like someone hijacking one of Elon's rocket ships for the purpose of trying to parajump from space onto the roof of my building. You can't say it's impossible, and that's the reason the anti-nuclear activists latch onto it. But what you can say is that nobody in their right mind would do that because it's not an effective way to get your hands on weapons-grade plutonium. It doesn't give you weapons-grade plutonium, and there's other, much easier ways that you could get your hands on plutonium if your goal was to make a bomb. Let's move on now to page 23. And here's the question I want you to ask yourself, listeners. What's better? Is it better to leave the plutonium, that's plutonium-239 and plutonium-240, it's all mixed together, you can't make a bomb from it, it's in spent nuclear fuel waste, and it's stacked up, as you see in the picture on the left, in these dry casks at nuclear power plants all around the world. That means somebody could go and steal it if they wanted to. I'm not sure why they would do that. There's really not much you could do from it. The alternative would be to change the rules and make it possible to recycle all of that spent nuclear fuel waste so that it's not causing the public annoyance and the upset attitude of the public who doesn't really understand what's in it. You could solve that problem and get rid of the nuclear fuel waste by burning it as kindling to start Thomas Jam's reactors or any other company's molten salt reactors that run on thorium and require a Kickstarter fuel. When you do that, you're burning the plutonium up. There's no way to make a bomb out of plutonium that doesn't exist anymore. So which one is safer? I contend the picture on the right is much safer. But we're not allowed to do that today because the U.S. government has adopted laws in 1954 that current U.S. government officials don't even understand, and nobody has any motivation to repeal. So again, if Elon and Vivek are listening, start with Section 123. That's what we need to reform. I want to move on now to a series of slides that I used in another presentation recently for the Stanford Alumni Association. I want to run through these really quickly to allow Thomas Jam most of the remaining time to talk about how his reactor works. So briefly, moving on to page 24, let's talk about the challenges of scaling nuclear energy, not just to make it a little bit bigger, but to fully replace fossil fuels. Well, moving on to page 25, the Triple Nuclear Initiative is the first step in that direction. That's based on conventional nuclear technology. They want to build another 742 gigawatts of electric generation capacity by 2050. That's going to cost somewhere between $4 and $11 trillion of capex. I want you to remember that number, $4 to $11 trillion of capex to triple nuclear energy, because I'm going to come back to that figure in just a couple of minutes. It's going to take 5 to 10 years to build each one of those power plants. Will end up solving about 11% of the overall problem, not really solving the whole problem. What happens to uranium demand under that scenario? Moving on to page 26. Well, it goes up to about 250,000 metric tons by 2050. A lot of people think that's too ambitious. It's going to be hard to ramp uranium supply up that much. I think it is possible, especially if we can get seawater recovery working, which is an experimental technology that's not yet been proven but is very promising. What happens, though, if you're going to triple nuclear energy is you're also going to triple nuclear waste. Moving on to page 27, you see that spent nuclear fuel waste in storage goes up to 750,000 metric tons by 2050 in the triple nuclear scenario. That sounds a little bit scary. Don't worry too much because I have a plan for what we're going to do with it. Moving on to slide 28, if you were to try to replace all of the energy that we get from fossil fuels today, that requires a 24x on nuclear, about $135 trillion of capex if it costs as much as the Vogtle reactors in Georgia cost. That's more than the money supply of the entire world, so obviously that's not possible. But hypothetically, if it were possible, what would it do to uranium demand? It would push us all the way up to 1.8 million metric tons per year. That's just not possible. You can't solve this problem with conventional nuclear technology. If you could, moving on to page 30, look at what happens to spent nuclear fuel waste. Almost 3 million metric tons by 2050. The public is never going to allow that, even if you educate them on why it's not as dangerous as they think it is. Nobody's going to stand for 3 million metric tons of nuclear waste. Page 31, clearly we need a completely different approach. I propose that approach should be to use thorium molten salt reactors as the iPhone reactor, the workhorse reactor of energy transition. Thomas Jam's company won't be the only one to play in this space, but I think they're doing the most pioneering work, and that's why I focus on their product when I talk about this in the presentations that I give. Moving on to page 32, we need to adopt thorium as our primary source of energy going forward. 33, here's my plan for energy transition in 3 steps. Step number 1, embrace this triple nuclear initiative. It's a good idea. Yeah, it's conventional nuclear technology, which is suboptimal in some ways, but it's technology that's here and now and available today that we can get started with. Yes, it's going to triple nuclear waste by 2050. That's okay with me. Why? Because step number 2 in my plan is to reprocess every single bit of nuclear waste that exists on the entire planet. Doing that would produce about 2,500 metric tons of plutonium. That's enough kindling to kickstart the first 12,500 thorium-fueled molten salt reactors, and we need a source for that kindling fuel in order to run those reactors. The triple nuclear will then provide enough additional nuclear waste to start another 1,100 or so, almost 1,200 further molten salt thorium reactors per year after that. Step number 3 in my plan is to fully replace all of the energy we get from fossil fuels today by building 1 reactor per hour. Thomas Jam's plan, when I first met him, he told me he wanted to create an assembly line that would build his waste burner nuclear reactors at a rate of 1 per day. And I thought, this guy's crazy. He wants to build 1 reactor per day. This industry has only built less than 500 of them in 70 years, and this guy wants to build 1 a day. He's got to be off by an order of magnitude. Well, he was off by an order of magnitude. It's just in the other direction from what I thought, because 1 reactor per day is not enough. You need to build 1 reactor per hour on fully robotic assembly and test lines, 24/7, 365 for 20 years straight, in order to build the 128,000 nuclear reactors at 100 megawatts thermal apiece that it would take to fully replace fossil fuels. The cost of doing that, the capex to do the whole thing, is somewhere between $4.5 and $7 trillion. Hey, wait a minute. What was the cost of tripling nuclear just a few minutes ago using conventional? Somewhere between 4 and 11 trillion. It's going to cost half as much to do a 24x on nuclear using Thomas Jam's technology as it would have cost to just triple nuclear using the conventional technology. That's how much economic advantage there is to thorium molten salt energy over conventional nuclear. And I am using some numbers that assume mass production on fully robotic assembly lines. What happens, though, if you want to replace all of the energy we get from fossil fuels? Well, isn't that going to create an immense amount of spent nuclear fuel waste? Moving on to page 34. No, what that's going to do is completely eliminate all spent nuclear fuel waste from existence by 2044 if we started tomorrow, because we're going to reprocess every single bit of that. That requires, Vivek, I hope you're listening, that requires a repeal of Section 123 so that we can get the whole world focused on reprocessing that spent nuclear fuel waste, turning it into kindling to run the style of nuclear reactors that Thomas Jam's company is pioneering in Copenhagen. What does that do to uranium demand? Well, tripling nuclear is going to create a huge amount of additional uranium demand, as you can see, taking us up to almost 250,000 metric tons, but doing almost 10 times as much, going another 9 terawatts or 9,000 gigawatts of thorium molten salt reactors of the type that Thomas Jam's company is proposing, only adds that tiny little purple sliver at the top. Why is it such a small amount of uranium demand? Because all you need is the kindling, the Kickstarter fuel. We're going to have to pay for some of that Kickstarter fuel being low-enriched uranium rather than reprocessed spent nuclear fuel waste. But the best source of it is spent nuclear fuel waste, and that requires regulatory reform. Okay, I had to get that off my chest, Thomas Jam, because I'm so passionate about this message. I want to give you most of the rest of the time. Let's talk about why you think the thorium molten salt reactor is the iPhone reactor that's going to be the workhorse of energy transition globally on page 36.
Yeah, so basically it's because the economics, the price is better, the neutron economy is much better. Classical nuclear reactors, they are so expensive that you almost always have to have some sort of government backing to build them. And also all these rules that you talked about, the Section 123 and other crazy rules around nuclear, makes it really expensive. So it's not really the materials in the nuclear reactors that are expensive. It's all these government rules and all the lawyers and all the bankers and so on that makes nuclear energy expensive. And I think we're at a moment in time where we can actually solve that problem once and for all. And we can get to some reactors that are much cheaper to build, even cheaper than coal or gas. And they can be mass manufactured. And the energy that comes out of them is the cheapest form of energy that we've ever known. And that's going to kickstart also a big economic boom in many of the Western countries. You know right now that Europe is sort of going in reverse, a negative spiral. And so moving on to slide 37, you can see the onion core. And that's really for Copenhagen Atomics. That is the major breakthrough, is that we were able to create a reactor core where we can actually make a molten salt reactor in thermal spectrum, which is quite small and therefore easy to mass manufacture. Doesn't need a lot of materials to build it. Doesn't need a lot of fuel to get it started. So it's a very, very efficient reactor. And it can be built out of existing materials. This picture on page 37, you see the onion core reactor photographed from the top. It's sort of a round ball. It's 2.5 meters in diameter. And that's the main thing that is inside the reactor. Of course, there's some other pipes and pumps and tanks that are also needed. All those pipes and pumps and tanks are made out of regular stainless steel. So again, not very expensive. So if we move on to slide 38, I will try to explain. That's the schematic of how the reactor containers that we talked about in previous slides, how they work, what's inside the reactor, how does it work, how is it different from classical nuclear reactors. So the main difference is that it's a liquid fuel instead of a solid fuel. And that's sort of what makes it possible. But there's also some things here that we have invented that are different from previous proposals of molten salt reactors. So if you look at this schematic of a reactor drawing, there's sort of a wall in the middle, an insulation wall, and there's a hot section to the left, and there's a cold section to the right. And the cold section holds heavy water because you need heavy water to slow down the neutrons. That's the moderator inside the onion core in the middle. And then you need the salts. The salts are the orange and red colored liquids. And then at the bottom of the container, you have some big square tanks where you have the liquids when the reactor is not running. When you want to turn on the reactor, you turn on these pumps, and the pumps pump the salts and the water around through the onion core. And then magically the nuclear reaction starts, and it creates a huge amount of energy. We can get 100 megawatts of thermal energy out of that reactor core, which is only 2.5 meters in diameter. And then as soon as you stop the pumps, you just cut the electricity to the pumps. Then all those liquids will drain back into those tanks at the bottom where it's safe. It cannot create a nuclear reaction when it's in those tanks. So it's a very simple way to start and stop this reactor. You will also see that there's no control rods, because in regular old classic nuclear reactors, you need a whole control room of people controlling the reactor, because you have to adjust those control rods in order to manage the nuclear reaction. But in molten salt reactors, it's different. They manage automatically. So it will automatically find a stable temperature and a stable amount of power that comes out of the core. And this means that you don't need a whole control room of people, and you don't need to have control rods that are super safe and cannot go wrong, because these reactors are much more inherently safe. And also these reactors run at atmospheric pressure, which means you don't need these very thick walls for high pressure containment of the radioactive materials. These are liquids, and you can pump them through regular stainless steel pipes. And as soon as you stop the pump, it drains back into a tank, and it's all safe. On page 39, we see sort of a cross-section view of the onion core, and you can see why it's called the onion core, because there's several different layers inside the supposed onion. The outermost layer is a thorium blanket. That's a thorium breeder blanket. This is where we convert the thorium into uranium-233. And as soon as that uranium-233 has been created, then it's transferred into the orange channel, which is the fuel channel, automatically. It's going on while the reactor is running. So that's online refueling of the middle of the reactor. And then we need a lot of layers of water in there. And that's heavy water. And it's not under pressure. It's just water below the boiling point, and mostly water in this core. And that's what makes it super efficient. And then, of course, there's the fuel channel. The fuel channel is sort of the orange color in the middle. And the fuel would come in at the bottom at 600 degrees. And 1 second later, it would go out of the top at 700 degrees. And then it goes over to these heat exchangers on the previous slide, where the heat is then moved out of the reactor container. And once it's outside the reactor container, it's no longer radioactive salts. If we move on to slide 40, we try to tally up what does those different parts inside that reactor container cost. Of course, there's the core, this onion core. It's difficult to construct, and it's made out of special materials. So it costs between $2 and $5 million. We've already ordered 2 of these cores from sub-suppliers. So this is not a hypothetical cost. This is actually what we paid for it. But of course, we paid less because we didn't use the right materials that you would use inside a reactor. We want to test it some more before we order it out of the right materials. But we already got quotes from suppliers for the real materials that are going to be used in a real reactor. So we already know what it costs to construct this one. Similar with the other things in the list below, you could say there's maybe a little bit of uncertainty on the cost. The container itself, it's not a standard ISO shipping container. It is a special purpose nuclear grade container. So it costs 300,000 euros, plus minus whatever, 10%. The tanks and pipes, similar price, 400,000 euros. Heat exchangers in between. And then you need a lot of electronics and sensors and finally the pumps. And if you tally all of that up, it's less than 10 million euros for each one of these units. And obviously, when we start to mass manufacture this, the price can come down further down for these components. And this is sort of what blew our mind almost 10 years ago when we realized this, that these reactors for molten salt can be built at a completely different cost than traditional light water reactors or solid fuel reactors. The cost of each unit will be less than $10 million, and it's very likely to come down in price when we start to mass manufacture. And of course, this is what makes this a big opportunity to use thorium molten salt reactors.
And I just want to add for our listeners' benefit that when I did my costing and came up with a cost of somewhere between $4.5 and $7 trillion in order to completely replace every single watt of energy that we get from fossil fuels today, that was based on a 10 million euro unit cost. You're actually saying here it could be as low as 4 to 8, so it could be that my numbers are high in terms of what it's really going to cost to replace every single watt of energy that we get from fossil fuels while simultaneously eliminating every single bit of spent nuclear fuel waste from existence on planet Earth, if we can just get the government out of the way to allow that to happen. I want to move on now and kind of change gears here to slide 41. Copenhagen Atomics is currently in the middle of an active capital raise. They're raising another $50 million of investment capital to keep developing this technology. As I've said before, I want, in the interest of full disclosure, for everyone to know that I am a angel investor in this company. I first invested in this company in the previous investment round. I've added to my position in the current investment round. I really want to emphasize, though, although I do need to say that for the sake of regulatory compliance, the reason that I'm excited to help the company to raise more capital is not because of my vested interest in the company's success, although I certainly do have that. It's because I couldn't be more passionate adamant about this being the right technology to solve energy transition for the whole planet. So they are involved in a capital raise. Longtime listeners know we normally give our guests 2 or 3 minutes at the end of each podcast to kind of pitch their wares and talk about what business they're in. I'm going to extend that for the sake of this holiday special and give Thomas Jam a good solid 10 or 12 minutes to give the investor pitch for the capital raise. So Thomas Jam, the floor is yours.
Yeah, so if we move on to slide 42, the long-term goal of Copenhagen Atomics is to mass manufacture these reactors in a gigafactory, just like we talked about previously. And where we want to start is an assembly line that can make one reactor every day. Certainly, we want to get the price down and, of course, the volume up over the years. And if we look at slide 43, we looked at how is the total energy of the world going to develop. And clearly, thorium energy is not on the market today. So in the next 10 years, wind and solar will continue to grow, but certainly also coal and oil and gas. I know that there's a lot of people on the internet that says that we're done with coal and oil and gas, but they simply don't understand the world if that's what they contest. This is my estimate of how much coal and oil and gas will grow over the next 2 or 3 decades. And I think thorium energy is going to grow as fast as it possibly can. And in my best estimate, by 2060, thorium energy will provide roughly the same amount of energy as gas does today. So it's a $1.5 trillion market by 2060. This is my estimate. And of course, it can go faster or slower, but it's clear when we introduce new technologies, you can look at the past of energy technologies. It takes a number of decades before things really catch on and start to get big. I've also said many times that I think by the year 2100, more than half of all energy in the entire world will come from thorium. So I do believe that this thorium energy is going to be the major energy source that is going to grow in the next 80 years from now. Just like we saw when we changed to the iPhone, shortly after that, we got also Android phones, and now we don't have any of those old phones that were before the smartphone. Now everything is smartphones. And I think we will see the same transition, even though in the energy sector, it takes a little bit longer than with iPhones, but we will see a major transition in the next 20, 30, 50 years, where thorium is going to be the main growth point in energy. So in Copenhagen Atomics, if we move to slide 44, we've already built 2 of these prototype reactors here in Copenhagen that we are testing. So it's not fantasy. It's actually something that is being built and tested currently. And we're currently building the 3rd reactor for testing here. It also shows there's no other startup company anywhere in the world that has already built or almost built 3 test reactors in full size. So that tells you that this technology is much lower cost than traditional energy. Slide 45, we already talked about that earlier today, so I'll skip over that. But it basically shows you it's a game changer. Again, slide 46, we also talked about that earlier, so I'll move on. I want to say on slide 47 that when we put the very first reactors online, sort of the first of a kind reactor, it's going to take a little bit longer to build those units than 1 year for a gigawatt power plant. So maybe it'll take 2 years for the very first one. But it is going to be much faster than traditional nuclear reactors. And also the fuel cost, even though it's not the breeder reactor, the very first one is probably going to come online in 2029 or 2030. And that's not going to be a breeder reactor, but we are definitely pushing towards breeder reactor. So you can say, okay, maybe the first one has a slightly worse.
Only 300 times better than conventional.
Yeah, only 300 times better than the solid fuel reactors. And mind you that when people talk about small modular reactors or advanced reactors, they are all down in this, close to this circle called uranium in the lower right corner. So what is really going on here is that if we go to slide 48, Elon Musk coined it and he called it the idiot index, but there was actually people before him that called it something else. But I think I like this term, so I'm going to use that here. He says that the idiot index is how much you have to pay for the product versus how much the raw materials for that product cost. And you can see here that I predict that for classical nuclear reactors, the idiot index is around 100. So basically the materials cost is a tiny amount of it. The manufacturing and the lawyers and the bankers are the majority of the cost. And if you look at other industries, of course, Boeing and Airbus is also very expensive products. But if you go back to Tesla, they really try to get the price down. And Copenhagen Atomics is in the same. We also try to get the cost of nuclear energy way down. So that is our claim to fame, that we bring something new to the table. A little bit about this capital raise. What are we going to use the money for? Here you can see how much money also we spent in the past on different prototypes. And we are working towards running the first test reactor in 2027 in Switzerland. We talked about that a little bit in the previous episode of the podcast. And we need almost 200 million euros in order to get to the test reactor in 2027. But right now we are only raising the 50 million euros, which we need right now for making fuel and making our lithium-7 production. And you can sort of see here how much capital we're going to use in the different years. We already have enough runway for the next 12 months, but of course we need to extend that. We also need to scale up our team. I will jump past the slides 50 and 51 because we already talked about those. And we also talked about the test reactor in Switzerland on slide 52.
You have a deal already where you're going to test this reactor. This is a picture of the facility where it's going to be tested?
So we are based in Europe right now, and one of the best national labs in Europe for testing nuclear technologies is called PSI, or Paul Scherrer Institute. It's located in Switzerland, close to Zurich. And this is where we've made a deal with that national lab to test our reactor in 2027. So we're already going through the approval process right now, where we're planning to build a new building to host that test, and also going through all the reactor approvals. And so the plan is to build the reactor in Copenhagen. If we move to slide 53, we will build the reactor in Copenhagen, and we will test it without a fission chain reaction here in Copenhagen. So basically heat it up with electricity and make sure that everything works. We will make the fuel salt here in Copenhagen as well. Then we will put all of it on trucks, drive it down to Switzerland, install it in their building and test it. And then once the test has completed, we will drive it back to Copenhagen again. So I think one thing here is to show that this technology actually works. I think we've already done a huge amount of work in simulating this. So we are fairly sure that it works. But of course, we still need to show it in the real world. But another first is also that normally you build nuclear reactors on site and they are never moved. But in doing this test in Switzerland and moving the reactor on truck down there, we actually also show to the nuclear industry that we can now move these reactors around. We can build them in one factory, move it around, set it up fairly quickly. Some of these companies that are making what they call small modular reactor, they still take 4 or 5 years on-site construction to build it. But we are going to show here that in a matter of a month, we can put it on a truck, move it to another country, set it up, and start it running. And we can also take it down again and move it back. This has not been done before in the nuclear industry. Well, it has been done in the military, but not in the traditional commercial nuclear industry. So this is the first time that we show that this is possible with these type of molten salt reactors or thorium reactors. And finally, ending on page 54, this is a picture of the 4 founders. We started the company back in 2014. The current valuation of the company is roughly $500 million US. And of course, the value of the company is going to grow significantly, maybe a factor of more than 100 by the time that we have commercial reactors operational. Here are some of the companies that we work with, companies and national labs around the world that are helping us prove that this technology works. And of course, feel free to contact us and get some more information about this investment round and also the exciting journey that our company is on.
So to summarize, folks, Copenhagen Atomics is raising $50 million against a pre-money valuation of $500 million. The guy to contact is Mike Christensen, their CFO. His email is invest@copenhagenatomics.com. We're going to leave it there for this episode. Patrick Ceresna and I will be back for our post-game segment in which we'll discuss investment opportunities in both Copenhagen Atomics and a few noteworthy companies in the nuclear fuel cycle. That's coming up next, right here at MacroVoices.com.
Now, back to your hosts, Eric Townsend and Patrick Ceresna.
Eric, great interview with Thomas Jam. After this episode, I finally understand what all the fuss about thorium has been all about. I definitely want to get your take on Copenhagen Atomics and your thoughts as an angel investor in that company. But let's start with the publicly listed investments relating to nuclear fuels.
Conversion and enrichment of uranium are going to be a major bottleneck in the nuclear fuel cycle in coming years. The big players like Cameco, that's ticker CCJ, are likely to benefit from higher conversion and enrichment prices. But there aren't many pure plays in this sector. One pure play that I own in my own portfolio and which I particularly like is Silex, that's ticker SLX on the Australian Stock Exchange. Silex and its founder, Dr. Michael Goldsworthy, are the principal inventors of the current generation of laser enrichment technology. That technology replaces centrifuges for enriching uranium in order to make enriched nuclear reactor fuel. And through a joint venture with Cameco, Silex is currently building the world's first large-scale commercial laser enrichment facility, which will enrich depleted uranium tailings left over from prior enrichment cycles. That stock has done incredibly well recently. It feels a little bit frothy here at over $6 as we're pre-recording this episode in early December, but I think it's a strong buy on a pullback below $5. Hopefully, this episode made clear why reprocessing of spent nuclear fuel waste should be a major growth sector if we can just get governments to reform their policies. The unquestioned leader in that space is going to be French company Orano, which does almost all of the commercial spent nuclear fuel waste reprocessing that occurs today. But Orano is still a private company. Now, they do have some publicly listed bond offerings, but I don't see those as an effective investment play on future growth of nuclear waste reprocessing. In my opinion, what's needed is first to get the regulatory reform that's necessary to greenlight the growth of this sector. Then I would hope that someone could organize a new venture to license Orano's technology and figure out how to deploy it very much at scale and all over the world. Transporting nuclear waste internationally to try to reprocess it in some central location probably doesn't make sense. It makes a lot more sense to figure out how to modularize the waste reprocessing operations and then deploy them at scale globally. But obviously, there won't be an investment argument for that until we can reform Section 123, which is the U.S. government's mechanism of bullying and control, which prevents the rest of the world from dealing with its nuclear waste responsibly.
Now let's dive into Copenhagen Atomics. You said last week that you both had a lot of strong positives and a few hesitations about investing in this company. Let's hear all about both.
To be sure, Copenhagen Atomics is my proudest and most passionate investment. I truly believe that they are visionary technology leaders who are pioneering the technology that has the most potential to truly change the course of human history by making nuclear energy markedly cheaper than energy from coal or gas. And that's the game changer that could be much bigger than the internet or any other trend that we've seen since the Industrial Revolution itself. And I really mean every word of that. But let's face it, folks, Copenhagen is pushing every imaginable dimension of the regulatory envelope. They don't just want to change the coolant from water to molten salt, something that until recently regulators were shy to even consider. They also want to change the fuel from uranium to thorium. And on top of that, their ideal deployment scenario involves kickstarting their thorium reactors with reactor-grade plutonium fuel recovered from reprocessed spent nuclear fuel waste. That would require reforming some of the longest-standing nuclear weapons proliferation rules in existence. Now, make no mistake, those changes are urgently needed in order to open the door for humanity to embrace the technology that can truly make nuclear energy cost less than half of what we pay for fossil fuel energy today. But how is a tiny little company like Copenhagen Atomics, that almost nobody has even heard of, going to take on the entire nuclear regulatory establishment and ask for a complete overhaul of rules that have been in place for decades, and frankly, which most regulators and lawmakers don't even understand? When I first invested in this company, I knew that it was more of a passion investment than a rational investment choice. I wanted to be part of changing the course of human history, and I was convinced that Copenhagen Atomics had invented the nuclear technology that could achieve that goal. But I also thought it was an extreme long shot that the company could pull off what they had conceived, primarily because of those regulatory roadblocks and the still very strong anti-nuclear attitude of regulators and lawmakers that still existed in 2022 when I first invested in this company. I'm a whole lot more optimistic now in 2024 than I was back in 2022. The reason has nothing to do with the company itself and everything to do with the complete sea change of government attitude stemming from the Triple Nuclear Initiative and just the overall change of government attitude that governments around the world seem to be embracing the agenda of advancing advanced nuclear technology in pursuit of energy transition. I mean, even John Kerry has gotten behind nuclear. That is a dramatic change of attitude by regulators, and that's the reason that I'm now far more optimistic for Copenhagen Atomics' future than I was when I first invested. I also think that the involvement of big tech in the nuclear sector is going to lead to more and more support for advancing nuclear technology well beyond the 70-year-old outdated light water reactor technology that all our existing nuclear power plants are based on. For now, the tech bros seem to be focused on fast sodium reactors and TRISO-fueled molten salt and gas-cooled reactors. But they'll eventually figure out the thorium story, and when they do, I predict that the tech companies will be a lot more effective in getting the rules updated to support what needs to happen next in this industry than little startup companies like Copenhagen Atomics ever could have hoped to have achieved on their own. So I'm a whole lot more optimistic now for Copenhagen Atomics prospects than I was a couple of years ago when I first invested with them.
Are there any other hesitations or concerns you have about Copenhagen Atomics?
Their strength is industry-leading thought leadership on how to get the cost of nuclear energy down to well below the cost of fossil fuel energy. But as brilliant as they are at the engineering vision, their weakness is still that the engineers are still running the company. Now, these guys are doing the absolute best work in the industry, so far as I can tell, yet almost nobody has even heard of this company. Why not? Well, I think it's because they are passionate technologists and engineers rather than marketing guys. Now, to be clear, they're doing a much better job as tech entrepreneurs than the average engineer-managed startup company. Thomas Jam has had past successes as an entrepreneur, and he's a very credible guy. But the bottom line is still that they are much better at engineering than they are at marketing and self-promotion. This company needs a world-class management team that's every bit as good at running the company as its amazing engineering team is at coming up with the technology that's needed to completely change the face of nuclear energy. The good news is that the founders fully understand this need, but the company is going through some understandable growing pains. Their first attempt at bringing in a business guy to be their CEO failed miserably. They bet on the wrong horse, an ex-Goldman Sachs guy who I wasn't at all impressed with. Now, they've recognized that mistake, and they've parted ways with the Goldman guy, which is excellent news. But they still need to grow their management team. And most importantly, they need to get this company noticed. Most people have never even heard of it. Almost nobody appreciates how different their approach is compared to all the other advanced nuclear companies. And in my opinion, that's because the engineer founders are a whole lot better at engineering than they are at marketing.
The last time you had Thomas Jam on MacroVoices, you felt a need to add a disclaimer message before the interview, stressing that you had hesitation about whether investment in Copenhagen Atomics was suitable for most of our listeners. I notice you didn't feel that way this time around. What's the story there?
When we planned that interview with Thomas Jam back in May, I was assuming that the company would have a reasonable minimum investment threshold. I was absolutely livid when their new CEO imposed a €1 million minimum investment, which I didn't even find out about until after we'd already booked Thomas Jam for that interview. That was plain and obvious incompetence on the part of their new CEO, and I was absolutely incensed by it at the time. This is an early-stage company with plenty of regulatory risk still ahead of it before its plans can be realized, and imposing a minimum investment threshold which effectively prices most high-net-worth individuals and small family offices out of the investment was just plain stupid, as was the approach that he tried to take to raising money from institutional investors who don't customarily take speculative technology risk. Predictably, he was not successful in those strategies, and he wound up parting ways with the company as a result. I'm glad to see him gone. He was a mistake. They've learned from that lesson, and I feel much more comfortable with their €100,000 threshold, which is what they've adopted now as their minimum investment. So I no longer see the need to add any kind of disclaimer at the front of the podcast, as I did back in May. But while we're on this subject, I still want to be super clear. This is a speculative investment. This sort of investment tends to have 100 in its result. Either you make 100 times what you invested because it's wildly successful, or you lose 100% of your entire investment because the company fails for whatever reason and goes bankrupt. So this absolutely positively is not the kind of investment that you want to put all or most of your net worth into. It's something where you invest money that you can afford to lose, knowing that that's a very real possibility. At €100,000, it's a reasonable investment risk for experienced, accredited investors who have at least several million euros of net worth, and we have plenty of those guys in our audience, so I didn't feel the need for the disclaimer this time around.
You first invested in Copenhagen Atomics in 2022. Are you planning to add to that investment in this current round?
I already did back in early December. And between my initial investment in the prior round and my follow-on investment in the current round, I'm now holding 15,300 B shares, which is a considerable investment. But I feel obliged to emphasize that my passion for being part of something that could literally change the course of human history is what's motivated this investment for me. Now, I do believe I'm actually a lot more optimistic now than I was when I first invested. I do believe it's going to be wildly profitable if the company can get past the regulatory hurdles that it has to overcome before it's allowed to commercialize thorium-fueled nuclear reactors. But I also know that losing 100% of my investment is still a very real possibility if government bureaucracy gets in the way. The good news is that government attitudes are changing, and they're changing rapidly. And I'm more and more optimistic for the company's future, much more so now than I was back in 2022 when I first invested. But if you want to make a quick buck on the nuclear renaissance, the way to do that is just to buy uranium mining shares. Copenhagen Atomics is a much longer time horizon investment, and it will be illiquid for several more years to come.
Based on your own comments, this investment still doesn't make sense at the €100,000 minimum investment threshold for anyone with less than several million euros of net worth. That would seem to rule out accredited investors who are just over the 1 million net worth threshold to qualify as accredited. And frankly, that's a big part of our audience. Is there any room for the company to be more flexible to accommodate those investors?
Yes, but not by direct investment. There's a small secondary market for shares in Copenhagen Atomics, and the company has done what it can to facilitate introducing the interested buyers and sellers to one another. You still have to be accredited if you're in the U.S. or meet the similar professional client rules if you're European. But then you can buy shares directly from other investors in any quantity. If you're interested in that secondary market, email the company at invest@copenhagenatomics.com and let them know what you're interested in, and please be patient if it takes them a few days to respond. They'll do their best to introduce buyers and sellers, but look, obviously they're not stockbrokers. They're in the nuclear reactor business, so they need to stay focused on the business that they're actually in. But they'll do their best to introduce interested buyers and sellers of the company's shares in a secondary market.
Okay, I think that covers it. And that's a wrap for the 2024 Holiday Special Series. We'll be back with our regular podcast format next Thursday, January 9th, 2025. Until then, we wish all our listeners a safe and happy holiday weekend.
That concludes this edition of MacroVoices. Be sure to tune in each week to hear feature interviews with the brightest minds in finance and macroeconomics. MacroVoices is made possible by sponsorship from BigPictureTrading.com, the Internet's premier source of online education for traders. Please visit bigpicturetrading.com for more information. Please register your free account at MacroVoices.com. Once registered, you'll receive our free weekly Research Roundup email containing links to supporting documents from our featured guests and the very best free financial content our volunteer research team could find on the Internet each week. You'll also gain access to our free listener discussion forums and research library. And the more registered users we have, the more we'll be able to recruit high-profile feature interview guests for future programs. So please register your free account today at MacroVoices.com if you haven't already. You can subscribe to MacroVoices on iTunes to have MacroVoices automatically delivered to your mobile device each week free of charge. You can email questions for the program to mailbag@macrovoices.com, and we'll answer your questions on the air from time to time in our mailbag segment. MacroVoices is presented for informational and entertainment purposes only. The information presented on MacroVoices should not be construed as investment advice. Always consult a licensed investment professional before making investment decisions. The views and opinions expressed on MacroVoices are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of the show's hosts or sponsors. MacroVoices, its producers, sponsors, and hosts Eric Townsend and Patrick Ceresna shall not be liable for losses resulting from investment decisions based on information or viewpoints presented on MacroVoices. MacroVoices is made possible by sponsorship from BigPictureTrading.com and by funding from Fourth Turning Capital Management, LLC. For more information, visit MacroVoices.com.